What exactly is going on between my son and the hospital woman? Madame Han's voice cut through the dining room like a blade through silk, and every conversation at the table died at once. Monique Obi felt the question land in her chest before she even looked up from her plate. Beside her, two empty chairs away, Han Yijun had gone very still, his hand frozen halfway to his glass. "Doctor," Monique said calmly. The room went silent. Madame Han's eyes narrowed. "I'm sorry. I'm a doctor," Monique replied evenly. "Not a hospital woman." A few guests exchanged startled glances. "The nerve," Madame Han said softly. "The absolute nerve to correct me in my own home." "You addressed me directly," Monique said. "I assumed accuracy mattered." "Mother," Yijun started, voice careful, measured. "This isn't the place." "I asked a question." Madame Han remained standing, her eyes fixed not on her son but on Monique, sharp and merciless. "I watched you take her hand. I watched her not pull away. I think this table deserves an answer, don't you?" The guests sat frozen mid-bite, candlelight flickering against crystal glasses nobody was touching anymore. A server near the kitchen door had stopped walking entirely, tray balanced and forgotten in his hands. Across the table, Hygiene set down her wine glass with deliberate slowness, lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be, her eyes flicking once toward Madame Han as if confirming a plan they'd never needed to speak aloud. Monique felt every eye in the room shift toward her. She could have stayed quiet. She could have let Yijun handle it, let him find some careful diplomatic phrase that protected everyone's dignity at once. Instead, she set down her napkin, looked directly at Madame Han, and spoke. "We're together," she said, voice steady, carrying easily in the silent room. "Yes, and I'm not ashamed of it." Gasps rippled outward like a stone dropped in still water. Somewhere down the table, an older man cleared his throat as if that small sound could fill the silence Monique had just cracked open. Madame Han's expression didn't crumble, didn't flush with anger, it simply went cold, glacial, the kind of stillness that promised consequences far worse than shouting ever could. "I see," she said quietly, and sat back down without another word, the silence somehow louder than her standing had been. Beneath the table, Yijun's hand found Monique's and held it, no longer hiding anything, his thumb pressed once against her knuckles as if to say, "I'm here, whatever happens next." Across the table, Hygiene's eyes glittered with something close to triumph. This was the opening she'd been waiting 3 years to find. If you've ever fallen for someone the world insisted you weren't allowed to have, stay with this one to the end, because what Monique is about to survive will make you believe love can outlast even the people determined to destroy it. Hit subscribe before we go back to where it all began. A few months earlier, none of this had existed yet, not the secrecy, not the danger, not the weight of an entire family's expectations bearing down on two people who'd simply wanted, for once, something quiet and theirs. It had started with a fractured wrist and a fake name. Yijun had come into the emergency room after a minor accident, giving the intake nurse a name that wasn't his own, sunglasses on indoors at 9 in the evening. Trying to disappear into a hospital chair like a man who'd never once needed to disappear from anything in his life. Monique had seen through the disguise within 30 seconds, not because she recognized his face, but because no ordinary patient carried himself like that, like the room owed him deference he hadn't even bothered to ask for. "You can take the sunglasses off," she'd told him, snapping on gloves. "I promise I won't be blinded by whatever it is you're hiding from." He laughed, surprised, like laughing wasn't something he did often around strangers. "Most people recognize me before I open my mouth. I don't really watch the news." That, he said, might be the nicest thing anyone's said to me all year. "Don't get used to it," she said, wrapping his wrist with quick, practiced hands. "I'm only this nice to patients who don't argue with me about ice packs. I would never argue with you. Everyone says that." Then I mention the ice pack. He'd watched her work in silence for a moment, something in his face shifting from amusement into a quieter kind of attention. "Can I ask you something that has nothing to do with my wrist?" "You can ask. I make no promises about answering." "Has anyone ever told you that you don't perform for people? You just exist in front of them." "It's rare. I notice it because almost nobody around me does it anymore." Maybe nobody around you has had to wrap your wrist while you flirt through the pain, she said, but something in her chest had moved anyway, small and unfamiliar. He came back 2 days later with a box of pastries from a bakery she'd mentioned in passing, claiming his wrist still hurt, though the wrap she'd given him had barely been disturbed. She called him on it immediately. "This is the worst excuse for a follow-up visit I've ever seen," she said, not even pretending to check the bandage. "I know," he admitted. "I couldn't think of a better one fast enough. Most people just ask for a number." "I'm not most people. I was hoping that would be obvious by now." "It's obvious," she said. "I just wasn't sure you knew it yet." It had been easy after that, in a way neither of them expected. Dinners in private rooms of restaurants he quietly owned shares in, where no one questioned why the lights were always lower in the back. Long drives through Seoul at night, tinted windows hiding them from a city that would have recognized him in an instant. His security detail trained, somehow, to simply not exist in her presence, fading into hallways and door frames so completely that some nights she almost forgot there were armed men 3 steps behind them at all times. There were quieter mornings too. Yi-jun, badly, attempting to cook the one dish his late grandmother used to make, flour on his sleeves and smoke curling faintly from a pan he refused to admit he'd ruined, insisting it was experimental, while Monique laughed so hard she had to sit down. Those were the moments she trusted most, the ones that had nothing to do with restaurants he owned or cars with tinted windows, just a man burning rice on purpose so she'd laugh at him instead of at the weight he carried everywhere else. "Doesn't it bother you?" she'd asked him once, watching one of his men pretend to study a menu he had no intention of ordering from. "Always being watched. Never just being a person." "It used to," Yi-jun admitted. "Now I don't really notice unless someone like you points it out." "That's not exactly reassuring." "No," he agreed, smiling. "But it's honest." She'd noticed the small things first, a landlord who'd been threatening to raise her rent illegally, suddenly going quiet for weeks. A delayed visa renewal for a colleague that resolved itself overnight with no explanation. A parking violation that simply vanished from the system before she could pay the fine. She never asked him directly. She suspected. He never confirmed it, not outright, but the careful way he avoided her eyes when she mentioned it told her everything she needed to know. "You don't have to fix things for me," she told him one night, after the 3rd unexplained convenience in a month. "I know," he said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got. I see a problem in your life, and some part of me wants it gone before you even finish describing it. I'm working on that." "Work harder," she said, though there was no real heat in it. They argued, gently, about the secrecy, Monique wanting honesty, wanting to exist in his life without the constant calculus of who might see them, who might report it, who might decide her existence near him was newsworthy. Yi-jun wanted more time, more distance from the moment his family would become a variable neither of them could control. "You don't understand what happens the moment my mother finds out," he told her one night, more tired than she'd ever heard him. "It isn't just disapproval. It's strategy. She'll treat you like a threat to manage, not a person to know." "Then let her find out sooner," Monique said. "Every day we hide this, you're telling me, without saying it, that I'm something to be ashamed of. That's not what this is. Isn't it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks exactly like that." "The second my mother knows," he told her, quiet and certain, "everything changes. I want to protect this for as long as I possibly can. I'd rather risk the cost than keep living like I'm something to be hidden," she said. Neither of them won that argument outright. Both of them, somewhere underneath the words, knew the dinner was coming eventually, knew there was no version of this story where the secret stayed buried forever. Now, a few months later, the secret was gone, dissolved into gasps and candlelight and Madame Han's terrible stillness. The first move came fast and quiet. The next morning, Madame Han arrived at Monique's apartment alone, dressed impeccably, carrying herself with the composed grace of a woman who'd rehearsed this conversation many times before walking through the door. "I'm not here to fight with you," she said, settling into a chair Monique hadn't offered. "I'm here to offer you something generous. A clean exit. No drama, no scandal, simply disappear from my son's life, quietly, and this becomes a sum of money substantial enough to change the entire trajectory of yours." Monique studied her for a long moment. You think I'm with him for money. I think you're young, ambitious, and practical. I'm offering you a practical solution. I'm not interested. You haven't even heard the number. I don't need to, Monique said. There isn't one that changes my answer, and I'd rather you believe that now than waste a second offer finding out. Madame Hahn's smile didn't waver, but something behind her eyes sharpened. This won't be the only offer I make. The next one may not be quite so generous. She left without another word, the threat hanging delicately in the air long after the door closed behind her. Monique stood in her own kitchen for a long time afterward, hands braced against the counter, replaying the conversation, trying to decide if she'd just won something or simply delayed a war she had no real way to win. That night, Yijun showed up at Monique's apartment, fury radiating off him in a way she'd never seen before, quiet, controlled, the kind that came from real power rather than helplessness. I know she came here. And I know my mother well enough to know she didn't come empty-handed, Yijun said. Yijun. Monique put a hand on his arm, steadying him the way she'd once steadied patience mid-panic. His jaw tightened. You don't understand what she's capable of. I understand exactly what she's capable of. I just watched her try to buy me like a problem on a spreadsheet. I'm telling you, I don't need you to retaliate. I need you to trust that I can say no on my own. And if saying no isn't enough for her, then I'll say it again. As many times as it takes. He backed down reluctantly, the muscle in his jaw still tight. It was the first real test of whether he could love her without fighting every battle on her behalf, and he hated, visibly, how hard that restraint cost him. The second attack didn't wait long. Within the week, Monique was summoned to the hospital administrator's office, blindsided by a formal complaint alleging a serious violation in patient care, falsified, fabricated, but detailed enough to trigger an immediate internal review. The administrator slid the file across the desk without quite meeting her eyes, as if he already suspected it didn't add up but lacked the authority to say so out loud. She was suspended on the spot, pending investigation, her license suddenly hanging by threads someone else had deliberately frayed. This doesn't match anything I've ever charted, she said, scanning the complaint twice, then a third time, looking for the patient name she didn't recognize attached to a procedure she'd never performed. I don't even know this patient. That's what the review will determine, the administrator said, not unkindly, but firmly enough that she understood the conversation was already over. The suspension should have remained confidential. It didn't. By evening, anonymous accounts online were already circulating rumors. Hospital woman under investigation. CEO's secret girlfriend faces medical misconduct claims. By the next morning, someone had posted a photograph of Monique entering the hospital months earlier, red circles drawn around her face. The comments were worse than the headlines. Gold digger. Career climber. She trapped him. Monique tried not to read them. She failed. 2 days later, she entered the staff cafeteria and conversations died instantly. Not one person met her eyes. The nurse who used to save her a seat every morning suddenly found somewhere else to be. Across the room, 2 residents lowered their phones the second she looked up. She didn't need to see the screen. She already knew what was on it. Her humiliation. For the first time since this began, Monique felt genuinely afraid. Yijun arrived at the hospital within the hour, and Monique watched, stunned, as the entire administrative wing rearranged itself around his presence, the administrator personally walking down to meet him, voices dropping to careful, deferential murmurs, doors opening before he reached them. One phone call, he told her, quiet and absolute. I can make this complaint disappear before the end of the day. No, Monique. I won't be saved, Yijun. I won't be handled like one of your business problems. I'll fight this on my own record, or it isn't really mine to win. He didn't argue further, though something in his expression looked like it cost him physically to stay silent. He stayed anyway, sitting beside her for hours that night while she pored over her own patient files searching for anything that could be twisted, ordering food neither of them touched, saying nothing except that he wasn't leaving. Why does this matter so much to you? He asked eventually, watching her highlight the same chart for the 3rd time. Letting me help, I mean. Why does it matter that you do this completely alone? Because the moment I let you fix everything, she said, not looking up, I stopped being someone who earned anything. I become someone things were given to. I've spent my whole life making sure that's never true about me. He was quiet for a long moment. I think that's the bravest thing I've ever heard anyone say. It's just self-respect. Most people don't have enough of it to sound brave saying it out loud. Near midnight, she finally set the files down, exhausted, and let her head rest against his shoulder. "Thank you for staying," she murmured. "Even when I wouldn't let you do anything." "Staying is the only thing you've actually let me do since this started," he said. "I'm not giving that up too." A colleague who owed Monique a quiet kindness from years earlier helped her trace the falsified complaint back to its source over the following days, digging through submission logs and timestamp records most people wouldn't have known to look for. Cross-referencing login times against shift schedules until one inconsistency finally refused to explain itself away. Not Madame Han, as Monique had initially assumed. "Hygiene," she told Yijun that night, watching something harden behind his eyes that she'd never once seen directed at anyone. "I'll handle her," he said, voice flat, certain. "Personally, if it comes to that." Yijun, no. "I've handled far worse people for far smaller reasons, Monique. This isn't a threat I'm making for show. I need to win this as myself," she said, gripping his hand. "Not as the woman protected by Han Yijun. Please. I'm asking you." He didn't promise easily. She watched the war happen behind his eyes, instinct against restraint. But eventually he nodded, something that looked almost like fear flickering across his face. Not fear for himself. Fear for what the world might still do to someone who kept refusing to let him shield her. Monique confronted Hygiene directly 2 days later, in a quiet corridor away from witnesses. Hygiene didn't deny anything. If anything, she seemed almost proud. 3 years, Hygiene said, voice tight with controlled fury. 3 years ago, when his father collapsed during that shareholder crisis, I was there. Monique said nothing. I sat with Madame Han when everyone else left. I attended meetings when Yijun couldn't. I learned this family, protected this family, and carried responsibilities nobody even noticed. Her laugh was short and bitter. Do you know how many people told me I was the obvious choice? How many times his mother looked at me and saw the future daughter-in-law she wanted? Her eyes hardened. And then you appeared. I didn't take anything from you, Monique said quietly. You did, Hygiene snapped. Maybe not intentionally. Maybe not maliciously. But everything I spent years building disappeared the moment he looked at you differently. For the first time, Monique didn't see a rival. She saw someone drowning in resentment she had mistaken for love. Monique relayed the conversation to Yijun that night. He was silent for a long moment, processing, before he spoke. My family's company holds significant leverage over her family's business, he said quietly. I've never used it. Never needed to. But the only reason she still has room to maneuver at all is because I've let you fight this your way so far. Don't use it yet, Monique said. Please. Let me finish this myself first. I'm trying, he admitted. It's costing me more than you know. Madame Han escalated next, summoning her son alone, delivering an ultimatum with the precision of a woman who'd been planning the exact wording for days. End things with Monique. Marry Hygiene as originally arranged. Or be cut off entirely, disowned from the family name, the company, the inheritance, every piece of the life he'd been born into. Think carefully before you answer, Madame Han said. I'm not asking you to choose a woman. I'm asking you to choose whether everything you were raised to inherit still means anything to you. Yijun didn't hesitate. I choose Monique, he said, voice steady, unwavering. I'd rather build something of my own from nothing than spend my life married to someone I don't love just to keep a name I never asked to inherit. Madame Han's expression flickered, shock, quickly buried beneath composure. You don't even know if this relationship survives the pressure I can put on it. I don't need to know that to know what I want, he said. I'm choosing her before any guarantee exists. That's what choosing someone actually means. You say that now. Let's see what you say once the company stops answering your calls. Then I'll start somewhere that does. That night, alone with Monique, he admitted something he'd never said aloud before. I'm frightened, he told her, voice rough. Not to lose the company. Of whether choosing me costs you more than it costs me. Whether my world keeps finding new ways to come for you long after tonight. I'm frightened too, Monique said, and meant it completely, no reassurance softening the edges. We don't get to pretend otherwise anymore. Not after tonight. I keep waiting to regret it, he admitted. Choosing you, knowing what it costs. And? I don't. Not even once. That terrifies me more than the cost does. It was the most unguarded either of them had been with each other in 8 months. Madame Han followed through on part of her threat almost immediately, freezing Yijun out of family business decisions, making his position within his own company a quiet, humiliating joke as whispers spread about the son who'd chosen a doctor over everything he'd been raised to protect. Doors that used to open for him now waited for someone else's signature. Meetings he once led continued without him, the agenda quietly rewritten to leave his name off it entirely. Monique watched him absorb the cost without complaint, watched the weight of it settle into his shoulders even as he refused to let her see it bother him. "This is because of me," she said one night, unable to hold the guilt back any longer. "This is because of choices I made," he corrected gently. "You didn't force my hand. You just finally gave me a reason to use it. That's a generous way of saying I'm the reason you're losing everything. You're the reason I finally noticed I was already losing myself long before any of this started." The words should have reassured her. Instead, they broke something loose. "What if this never stops?" Monique asked. Yijun looked at her. "My mother. The company. The rumors. What if 5 years from now we're still fighting the same battle?" "We won't. You don't know that." Silence stretched between them. For the first time since they began this relationship, Monique looked exhausted rather than determined. "Maybe I should leave." The words landed between them like shattered glass. Yijun went completely still. "Don't. I'm serious." "I know." Tears filled her eyes. "I'm becoming the reason your life is falling apart." For the first time, she saw genuine anger cross his face. Not at her. At the idea. "Don't you dare decide that for me." His voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "You don't get to tell me what my life is worth." Monique stared at him. "You don't get to tell me that choosing you was a mistake when I am standing here telling you it wasn't." The silence that followed felt raw, terrifying, honest, and somehow more intimate than any declaration of love either of them had ever made. He began moving independently after that, quiet meetings she wasn't told about until afterward, the early architecture of something separate from his family's company entirely. When she found out, she asked him directly if he was doing it for her. "I'm doing it for myself," he said. "You just happen to be the reason I finally found the nerve to start." Desperate now, watching her 3-year plan visibly collapsing around her, Hygiene made her final and most dangerous move, escalating the falsified complaint with manufactured evidence engineered to make the case against Monique airtight, designed to end her license permanently rather than simply delay her career. But the colleague who'd helped Monique before had kept meticulous records, timestamps, submission logs, a paper trail showing exactly when and how the documents had been altered. In the formal review hearing, seated across a long table from a board that had already half decided her guilt, Monique presented it herself, calm and precise, dismantling the fabricated complaint piece by piece. She walked them through the original timestamps, then the altered ones, then the single login that placed Hygiene at the terminal at the exact hour the file had been changed. Watching the certainty drain visibly from the board members' faces as the truth replaced the version they'd been handed. Yijun sat in the back of the room, silent the entire hearing, present only because Monique had finally allowed him to be there as support rather than as a weapon. One board member, an older woman who'd said almost nothing through the entire proceeding, finally set down her pen and asked Monique a single question: why she hadn't simply requested the case be reassigned away from a panel with personal ties to the accuser. Monique answered without hesitation, because the truth didn't need a friendlier room to survive in, only an honest one. When the board cleared her completely, voting unanimously to dismiss every charge, the decision didn't stop there. The board chair cleared her throat and looked directly at Monique. "There is one more matter." Monique blinked. Several members exchanged glances. "The conduct you demonstrated throughout this process has not gone unnoticed." The older woman who had questioned her earlier nodded once. "When this began, many of us assumed influence would solve it." Her eyes briefly shifted toward Yijun. It didn't. They returned to Monique. "You did." Yijun said nothing, did nothing, just watched her win it entirely on her own terms, pride written across his face more openly than she'd ever seen. 3 weeks later, Monique was appointed to lead a new patient care initiative at the hospital, a position that placed her on a leadership track few doctors reached so early in their careers. For the first time since the scandal began, she wasn't simply getting her life back. She was moving forward. The board didn't stop at clearing Monique. They referred Hygiene's conduct to outside authorities for falsifying medical documentation, a consequence far heavier than anything she'd managed to inflict. Word reached Madame Han within hours, forcing her to finally see the full shape of what Hygiene had been doing: sabotage, fraud, manipulation dressed up as years of patient ambition. Every kindness Madame Han had ever extended to her now recast in a light she couldn't unsee. Even after the hearing, Madame Han refused to apologize. For nearly 2 weeks, she convinced herself there had to be another explanation. Some details she had missed. Some manipulation she hadn't yet uncovered. Then she reviewed the evidence herself. Every document. Every timestamp. Every statement. Twice. The facts left no room to hide. Worse still, she discovered something else. Monique had possessed enough information to destroy Hygiene months earlier. She simply hadn't used it. No revenge. No public humiliation. No abuse of Yijune's influence. Just patience, integrity, and truth. Madame Han realized, with growing discomfort, that the woman she had spent months calling dangerous had behaved with more restraint than anyone else involved, including herself. Madame Han, who'd built her entire case against Monique on the certainty that she was the dangerous one in this story, sat alone with the wreckage of her own judgment for a long time before summoning Monique one final time. "Why?" she asked quietly, none of her usual composure performing for an audience now. "Did you never once try to use my son's power to fight back? It would have ended every threat I made instantly. You could have crushed Hygiene the moment you found proof. You chose not to. Why?" "Because I didn't want to win by becoming the kind of person who uses power as a weapon," Monique said simply. "That was never who I was, with or without your son in my life. Even when it would have cost you everything to lose? Especially then. Winning that way wouldn't have felt like winning. It would have felt like becoming someone I didn't recognize, just to keep something I wanted to deserve." Madame Han studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind her eyes, not quite warmth, but the beginning of it. "I judged you the moment I saw you," she admitted. "I assumed ambition where there was only character. I was wrong, Dr. Obi. I see that clearly now." The apology cost her visibly, pride bending in a way Monique suspected it rarely had before. "Yijun is fully welcome back into this family," Madame Han continued. "Not because he bent to my will. Because I finally bent to see what was true in front of me. He doesn't need your permission anymore," Monique said gently. "But I think he'd still want it. That's different from needing it." Hygiene's downfall arrived swiftly and publicly afterward, 3 years of careful positioning collapsing entirely under the weight of her own actions rather than anyone else's revenge. There was a strange justice in that no one had needed to destroy her. She'd done it herself, one falsified document at a time. Yijun proposed 3 weeks later, no spectacle, no audience, just the same quiet certainty he'd carried since the night he'd refused to let his mother's money work. Yijun smiled softly. "You know," he said, "this is still the worst follow-up appointment I've ever scheduled." Monique stared at him, then laughed through sudden tears. "Your wrist healed months ago." "I know." He dropped to one knee. "But I was hoping you'd agree to a lifetime treatment plan." Her hand flew to her mouth. The ring box opened. The room seemed to disappear around them. "I almost lost everything," he said. "The company. The inheritance. The future everyone planned for me." His gaze never left hers. "And none of it mattered next to losing you." His voice softened. "I chose you when it cost me everything." A pause. "And I'll keep choosing you every day after this." The tears spilled freely now. "Marry me." "Yes," Monique whispered. Then laughed. Then cried harder. "Yes. Obviously yes." The answer arrived before he'd even finished standing. The woman once humiliated in front of guests, accused publicly of being nothing more than a passing scandal, stood now beside the man who'd given up everything rather than give her up, proof that some things, built quietly enough and honestly enough, survive every storm sent to break them. If this story reminded you that real love doesn't need anyone's permission to be real, let me know in the comments where you'd have drawn the line, and subscribe for the next story before it disappears from your feed.